important people were afforded a private death behind the walls of the tower. Everybody else faced the humiliation of a public execution outside the walls, where I just showed you, oftentimes watched by thousands. Hi everyone, it's Margot here with another episode of Crown and Kingdom. His Majesty's fortress, the Tower of London, is much more than a tower. A palace, a prison, a citadel, an armory, a castle. It's one of my favorite places in all of London. Whether you're watching this video to help you plan a trip to the tower, or whether you're just coming along to travel with me virtually, I hope you enjoy this highly detailed tour of all the various buildings that make up this fascinating complex. If you do like this video, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help me keep my channel growing. Looming over the northern banks of the River Thames, the Tower of London has had many uses throughout its varied history. A palace, a fortress, a prison, a royal mint, a zoo, a museum, an arsenal, a garrison, and of course, a site of execution. The first fortress here was begun in 1067 in an effort by William the Conqueror to overawe the citizens of London shortly after his successful takeover of the English throne. Originally, his Norman fortress was made of timber and built into the southeastern corner of London's Roman city walls. The stone version was finally constructed in the late 1070s and is thought to have been finished in the 1090s. The estimation of the completed date comes from the fact that the tower's first recorded prisoner, Bishop Ranulph Flambard, was locked away here in the year 1100. The bishop himself would also be the first prisoner to escape the dreaded fortress, managing to wrangle his way out by using a rope that had been smuggled to him in a bottle of wine, which is why I keep no fewer than a dozen bottles within arm's reach at all times. You can see a lovely seating area and the wildflowers in the ditch surrounding the tower, which would have originally been part of the defensive moat laid out by Edward I in the 1270s. It was drained on the orders of the Duke of Wellington in the 1840s after the water became polluted, and during the Second World War it was used as an allotment where tower residents grew their own food to boost their rations. We are crossing the former moat and entering the fortress through the Byward Tower. This structure was constructed in the 13th century by Henry III in an effort to add further security measures to the complex. This artist's impression, commissioned by historic royal palaces, shows how the entrance may have looked back then. The Byward Tower is not open to the public, but houses a truly unique piece of art, a mural affectionately referred to as the Byward Angel. This is one of the finest examples of medieval wall art in the country and dates from the late 14th century. The mural was partially destroyed in the 16th century when a fine Tudor chimney was built here. Although it features a lovely surviving Tudor rose, it covered up a large portion of the artwork. Depicted here is St. John the Baptist, the Virgin Mary, St. John the Evangelist, and St. Michael the Archangel. It's believed that underneath the Tudor chimney breast was likely an image of Christ on the cross. Note that the image of St. Michael depicts him holding a scale and weighing the souls of the dead. In fact, an imp is still visible on one of the scales, as you can see here. This painting was likely deliberately placed in this room for a purpose. At the time this artwork was created, this room would have held the King's Exchange, part of the Royal Mint, and the workers here would have been using scales not dissimilar to the ones depicted here. Of course, working in the mint meant handling a great deal of the king's gold, and it was important that the staff doing so were trustworthy and honest, so this mural is a gentle reminder that they were being watched and judged by a higher power as they carried out their work. The workers at the King's Exchange in the Byward Tower would be a group of many who had such roles here throughout the years. The Royal Mint was founded in 866, and from 1279 to 1810, it was located right here inside the Tower of London. In fact, the left turn I'm making now takes us onto what is known within the tower as Mint Street. In the former lodgings we're about to enter is now a museum dedicated to the history of the mint at the Tower of London. Interestingly, the minting of coins didn't happen all the time. Many mint workers were laborers or farmers who would be sporadically called to the tower when new coins were needed, and the period in between minting could last for years. Typically, minting took place in the summer with longer daylight hours. This was good visually, of course, but also because cold, numb hands could make slower work or lead to more accidents. Actually, historically, coin-making was a dangerous business. The mint was full of hot furnaces. It would have been extremely noisy, and it would have been full of dangerous chemicals. Before mechanization, the process of coin-making was done entirely by hand, and very few who worked here would have finished their careers with all 10 fingers intact. Here, you can see replica tools that would have been used at this mint. Similar tools were used by clippers, criminals who would sell silver they had illegally clipped off the edges of coins. But clipping was a dangerous game. Any tampering with or forging of coinage was considered treason, and punishments were severe, including hanging, drawing, and quartering, or for women, being burned at the stake. This case holds a number of trial plates, sheets of gold and silver distributed to the mint, which were regularly compared to coins being made here. If the coins weren't identical to the trial plate, the master of the mint would be in hot water, indeed. The two on the left date from 1542, during the reign of Henry VIII, and those on the right from the reign of his daughter, Elizabeth I, in 1560. Debased coins from Henry VIII's reign are displayed above. By the 1600s, screw-operated presses like these had become the norm. These were safer and easier to use than traditional tools, and the newly made coins were thicker, which prevented them from being clipped. These presses were introduced in Paris, and the mint employees who first worked with them had to swear an oath of secrecy not to tell anyone about this grand new invention. It's also worth noting that before photographs and television, often the coins made here at the tower were the only way the public would ever know what their king or queen looked like, so likenesses were carefully created. It's hard to get clear images through the glass, but I've done my best. Here, you can see my favorite, King Charles II. Now this coin actually bears a small elephant at the bottom, indicating the gold to create it was mined in Africa. Here's another of Charles, and one of King William III. And lastly, here's one of Queen Elizabeth I. The mint finally moved out of the Tower of London in 1810 and is currently located in Wales. All right, now we're walking down what's known as Water Lane, between the walls of the inner ramparts on the right and the back of what's called the King's House, which we'll see the front of later, here on our left. Currently, this is the home of the resident governor of the tower. It is thought that the King's House was originally built for Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn, where she stayed both the night before her coronation and just less than 3 years later, the night before her execution. The tower above us here leads us to part of the original medieval palace. But before we go inside, I want to show you something else. Traitor's Gate. This infamous tower gateway was the last stop for many of those poor souls who were to be prisoners inside the Tower of London. This view shows the outer side. The gate was constructed by Edward I in 1275 to provide direct access from the river to the king's palace inside the tower. It would later increasingly be used for prisoners of the crown who would be taken from the city to the tower for their imprisonment or execution, giving the gate its name. The journey here would have taken prisoners under London Bridge, where the heads of executed treasonous criminals were displayed on pikes, a morbid hint of what was to come for many of them. The flowers you can see here are part of a temporary display made up of nearly 30,000 ceramic poppies commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. I'll tell you more about those later in the tour. Now we're going to make our way to the rooms above Traitor's Gate to view the original medieval palace rooms, which have just recently been refurbished. The rooms we're about to enter were built by King Edward I, and the adjoining Wakefield Tower, which we'll also explore, was built by his father, King Henry III. Both of them were part of the huge palace complex that stood within these walls in the medieval era. Henry, in particular, is responsible for a lot of what we see at the tower today, including the curtain wall we will later walk along. I want to make a note that what we see within these rooms is not original, but these are highly researched recreations of what this space would have contained in the 13th century. This is a stonemason's table, a nod to Master Robert of Beverley, who headed the original building works here, as well as serving as the Master Mason of Westminster Abbey. Here we can see what remains of a large fireplace. The lighting came out kind of strange on the camera, but I do want to point out that all of these rooms would have been expensively furnished, and every inch would have been decorated with bright and colorful tiles, wall paint, and textiles. Colorful furnishings were a sign of great wealth in the medieval period. I really love the detail on these stands that bear the ropes to keep people from touching the displays. They look like lions. I'd have these in my house for sure. The next chamber we're going to visit is draped in rich and beautiful fabric. In addition to a sign of wealth, hanging curtains and tapestries were necessary to keep castle occupants warm, as the stone buildings were quite chilly. The display panels in this area give us information about two former inhabitants, King Edward I and his wife Eleanor of Castile, and highlights members of their courts. Edward had a household of over 500 people with varying responsibilities, such as tending to his personal needs, making up the core of his armed forces, advising him in the running of his country, or even looking after his pet polar bear. Eleanor's household was made up of around 150 people, including a jeweler, coachman, and a number of scribes. Eleanor loved reading and had a private scriptorium, usually only found in monasteries, where manuscripts were copied and illuminated. Note that this entire court was constantly on the move, so all furniture and furnishings were made to come apart easily and be packed away, including the king's lavish bed. This version has been faithfully recreated based on surviving illustrations and accounts from Edward's household. The king would have slept on layers and layers of bedding, starting with 3 canvas pallets stuffed with straw, which were under a canvas of horsehair, which was under a canvas of feathers, which was under linen sheets, which were under woolen blankets, which was under a fur-lined coverlet. These were then topped with woven bolsters and silk pillows stuffed with feathers and surrounded by wool and linen curtains, just like my bed at home. Here we see the recreation of his fireplace, featuring richly covered coat of arms, his being the 3 gold lions on the red shield. Next to the fireplace, we find the entrance to the king's private chapel, where he would have prayed multiple times throughout the day. The king's chaplains, as well as all his religious paraphernalia, would have traveled with him. Look at the beautiful tiles on the floor. When I say the king traveled, I don't mean occasional trips. Monarchs and their staff were constantly on the move, sometimes nearly continuously, with kings moving their entire household up to 50 or even 60 times throughout the year. Travel was a way to be seen by the public, network with nobility or foreign diplomats, or to escape outbreaks of plague and sickness. Some kings had favorite locations, of course, but as for Edward I, he actually only spent a total of 53 days at the Tower of London throughout his entire 35-year reign. We're now in the Wakefield Tower, built by Edward's father, King Henry III, between 1220 and 1240. This would have been the king's audience chamber, and here is his throne. This recreation is based off the coronation chair at Westminster Abbey, which had originally been designed for Henry's son, King Edward, around the year 1300. The pattern on the luxurious canopy features the Plantagenet family lions, and they also appear at the base of the throne, upon which the king would have rested his feet. Directly opposite the throne is another private chapel, hidden behind a beautifully detailed and decorated wooden screen. This small chapel is associated most with King Henry VI, a direct descendant of King Edward, who we've been speaking about. For those who like specifics, Henry was Edward's great-great-great-great-grandson. Henry VI died in the Tower of London in 1471 during the Civil War over the English throne, known now as the Wars of the Roses. His supporters claimed that he did not just die, but was in fact murdered while praying here at his favorite chapel, right where that plaque is. Since 1923, a small ceremony has been held here every year on the 21st of May to commemorate the anniversary of Henry's death, known as the Ceremony of Lilies and Roses. We next make our way to the Cradle Tower, which is just directly up ahead of us toward the right, built between 1348 and 1355 for King Edward III, as his private Watergate entrance into the tower. But the Cradle Tower was also the scene of an incredible escape from this fortress. During the reign of the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, a number of Catholics were being tortured and held prisoner here. In 1597, 2 of them, John Arden and a priest, John Gerard, began secretly sneaking messages to one another, written in invisible ink made from oranges. The priest also made crosses and rosaries from orange peels, within which he hid secret notes which were then dropped out of the tower into the river below to members of the Catholic underground. On the night of the 4th of October, 1597, having made friends with his jailer, Gerard was permitted to visit Arden to say Mass. The two made their way onto the roof, where they could see their friends in a boat awaiting them below. Gerard threw down a string, to which his rescuers attached a rope. Gerard pulled the rope up into the tower and he and Arden used that rope to lower themselves into the awaiting boat. Here you see a prison cell and the oranges with hidden notes on the table. Gerard's hands had been mangled from the torture he had underwent here at the tower, but his escape was a success, and he eventually fled to Europe, where he lived out the rest of his days. We are now going to head up onto the ramparts that run along the southern edge of the tower to visit the Lanthorn Tower. From up along the walls you can see more of the poppies on display surrounding the formidable White Tower. In the center of this vast complex, the White Tower was the first of these buildings to be constructed. You can see the sheer amount of poppies all over here. The Lanthorn Tower ahead was also previously part of the medieval palace, although it was gutted by a fire in 1774. Edward I's son, Edward II, preferred to stay in this part of the palace, so at one time this was actually the king's bedchamber. Displayed within are various objects relating to 13th century court life, such as this toy knight, dating from the early 14th century. It depicts a little knight wearing a chainmail shirt and helmet, riding on horseback. Reportedly, Edward I would give his sons toy castles and knights in the hope that they would grow up to be great warriors. My parents had a similar line of thinking, but my career as an astronaut never quite took off. And I love this, a crystal chess piece that dates from around the year 1000. Carved from rock crystal, it's likely a king. Chess was very popular in England's medieval courts, and it's known that King Edward I gifted his wife, Eleanor of Castile, a crystal and jasper set as a gift in 1286. There's also a stylus made of bone, which was used to write on wax tablets, as well as this portable altarpiece, convenient for the king's ever-moving court. Now, we come back out onto the ramparts toward the Salt Tower. During times of peace, the Salt Tower was used for storage, perhaps of salt, which only the very richest members of society could afford. But throughout its history, the tower has also been home to a number of prisoners, including John Balliol, puppet King of Scotland, a number of Jesuit priests, and Hugh Draper, a Bristol innkeeper accused of practicing sorcery. Many of the prisoners kept in here left carvings in the walls, and their marks are now behind plexiglass panels to preserve them. I'll show you some of the more interesting ones. A wounded foot, left behind by a Catholic prisoner, which represents the wounds of Christ. A globe, thought to have been carved by Hugh Draper, an astrologer imprisoned for practicing witchcraft. This panel has a lot to show us. Firstly, at the top, there are the remains of paint and plaster put here in the 19th century when yeoman warders, who I will discuss in detail later, used this room as their accommodation. Below that, and to the left, is a carving left behind by an Edward Hurst, who recorded the date of January 24th, 1587, and mentions he was a guard of M.M., believed to be Michael Moody, accused of trying to murder Queen Elizabeth I. And to the right, beneath the black and white marker, is a carving made in 1983 by someone with the initials R.H., a more recent addition. Below that, we can read William and the start of a surname, Blower, perhaps. Here is another religious motif, this one a wounded heart. The letters IHS make up a Jesuit symbol, and the MA next to it represents Mary and Jesus. But the real masterpiece is over here, another work by Hugh Draper. It's an incredibly intricate astronomical clock. Hugh, accused of witchcraft, claimed that he had previously been interested in magic, but had burned all of his books. This chart, including all the zodiac signs, seems a risky motif to carve, given all his charges. The position of it, low to the ground, leads many historians to believe that Hugh was very ill by the time he crafted this, and had to carve it while lying on the floor. As for what happened to Hugh after his stint in the tower, we have no idea. His eventual fate is still a mystery to this day. We are coming back out onto the battlements here, on the eastern side of the complex, and in a moment we'll get a nice glimpse of the northern side of Tower Bridge. Sometimes, when I'm on these walls, I think back to Queen Elizabeth I. In 1554, when she was 20, her sister Mary locked her away in the Tower of London, fearing that she was plotting against her. Here's the edge of the bridge. Staff and members of the public reported seeing Elizabeth walking along the walls day after day. I often wonder if she was thinking of her mother, executed here nearly 20 years beforehand. Luckily, Elizabeth would be released after just 2 months. This next part of the battlements depict how the tower may have appeared during siege. The tower was besieged several times throughout the centuries, but was only successfully breached once during the Peasants' Revolt in June of 1381. The revolt began in response to a third new tax in 4 years, and a tax that was levied regardless of individual wealth. The rebellion quickly gathered momentum in the southeast, and eventually around 10,000 people marched on London. The young king, Edward II, his mother, and their household immediately fled to the safety of the tower. But Edward believed he could defuse the situation and rode out to meet the rebels. Intending to return quickly, it was ordered that the tower's portcullises were not to be dropped behind him, enabling a troop of 400 rebels to walk right in. The tower was ransacked, members of the royal family were harassed, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was murdered. Richard did successfully bring the mob to heel, but he would eventually find himself prisoner in his own tower after being successfully deposed by his cousin, King Henry IV. This next building, the Constable Tower, was rebuilt in the 19th century and tells the story of the Peasants' Revolt. There's also a scale model of the Tower of London, although the lighting made it tricky to catch on camera. Back onto the wall walk, and look what we have over here. One of the Tower of London's legendary ravens. There's a family of ravens living in the tower at all times, usually a minimum of 6. Supposedly, this dates back to an old superstition. Now, the origins of this legend are not clear, but I am going to share my favorite story with you. The son of a deposed and executed king, and you can find out more about that in my video linked here, and forced out of his home country to save his life, King Charles II finally returned to Britain and claimed his crown in 1660. However, he never quite felt secure on the throne, could never get over the feeling that something like what happened to his father could happen to him. The king was quite superstitious and had heard a rumor that a local wise woman had had a prophecy about the future king and his kingdom, and that she had a warning to give him. Charles asked that this woman be brought to him, and she began to explain her vision. She said that she knew there were ravens at the tower, and this was true. Charles was an avid bird lover and had built himself a royal aviary in Westminster, and the king was intrigued that she should know this. She then elaborated that should the ravens ever all leave the tower, then the king would lose his throne and the monarchy would crumble. Not wanting to take any chances, Charles declared that at all times there should be at least 6 ravens living at the tower, an order that has been carried out to this very day. Now, like I say, this is only a legend, but either way, the practice of keeping ravens at the tower is now an important part of life within this complex. The ravens are under the care of a beefeater known as the Raven Master, who, at the time of this tour, is Barney Chandler. Barney raises them from when they hatch, and they only listen to him, much to the consternation of guests who have their food nicked by one. The birds are individually identified by colored bands around their legs, so I can tell you that this raven's name is Jubilee. In 2025, 2 new ravens were born as part of the tower breeding program, Henry and Poe, named for the many King Henrys associated with the tower, and Edgar Allan Poe, famous for his poem, The Raven. Although their wings are trimmed, they are able to fly. In fact, one made it as far as Greenwich before being returned, but their comfortable enclosure, run of the buildings, and plentiful food keeps them pretty happy where they are. They're fed on a luxurious diet of assorted raw meats like chicks and mice, as well as their favorite treats, biscuits soaked in blood. Yum. All right, we are now going to continue our walk along the walls and head into the Martin Tower. This is another part of the complex built on the orders of King Henry III. On and off throughout the centuries, the king's treasures and the crown jewels were kept in this tower, and it had also held prisoners in the 16th and 17th centuries. Today, however, the Martin Tower hosts an exhibition all about the Beefeaters, detailing their history, highlighting a few key figures, and displaying some interesting objects, such as these keys, dating from around 1900, which once opened various doors within the tower complex. And this state dress uniform, note the initials of Queen Elizabeth II. The passing of a monarch means a change of uniform for the Beefeaters. Although you and I call them Beefeaters, their actual titles are Yeoman Warders of His Majesty's Royal Palace and Fortress, the Tower of London, and members of the Sovereign's Bodyguard of the Yeoman Guard Extraordinary. Yes, really. The name Beefeater has an unclear origin, but has been in usage since at least the 17th century. The Beefeaters themselves go with the likely theory that at one point the yeoman warders at the tower were lucky enough to be given daily rations of beef at a time when many people wouldn't be able to afford such luxuries. Thus, perhaps derisively, the public began referring to the warders as the Beefeaters, a nickname that has lasted over 500 years. The origin of the yeoman warders at the tower dates back to the reign of Henry VII in 1485. This early date also makes the yeoman warders the oldest existing military corps and oldest of the royal bodyguards in the country. Since the Victorian era, the role of the Beefeaters has been more front of house rather than guarding prisoners or protecting the crown jewels. A lot of their time is spent greeting and guiding. Today, one of the criteria to becoming a beefeater is to be suited to dealing with the public on a day-to-day basis. But there are far more stringent criteria than all that. All yeoman warders are retired members of the armed forces. They must have been a former warrant officer, Class 1 or 2, or equivalent rank in other services. They must have earned the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal, and they must have served a minimum of 22 years in the regular armed services. No easy feat. In addition to their roles as the face of the Tower of London as greeters and guides, the Beefeaters also complete ceremonial and security duties throughout the year that have changed little throughout the centuries. And a perk of their job is that they actually live on site here with their families in apartments arranged throughout the complex, which means it's a pretty easy commute to work. In times gone by, the tower actually had its own school for the children who lived here with their families. Next, we're heading toward the Brick Tower. But first, take a look down here and you'll see some metal work monkeys. Elsewhere in the tower, there is also an elephant, as well as a polar bear, which is reference to a white bear given as a gift from King Haakon IV of Norway to King Henry III of England. What do you gift a person who has everything? Exotic animals, of course. In centuries gone by, it was commonplace for leaders of nations to gift each other native animals in a weird kind of zoological diplomacy. Back to the Brick Tower, which has little historical significance, but these days tells the story of the Tower of London as a royal menagerie. The first animals on record at the tower belonged to King Henry III, who was gifted 3 leopards, or lions, in 1235 by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Henry enjoyed this gift so much, he was determined to create his own zoo, hence the polar bear. Henry would actually put the bear on a leash to allow him to go fishing in the River Thames. In fact, Londoners would come out specifically to watch the king's polar bear hunting for his lunch. In 1255, an African elephant joined the collection, a gift from King Louis IX of France. Note that the ghost of the beast is known to haunt the Tower of London, and some think it may be the spirit of Henry's bear. You can hear more about that story in my Ghosts of the Tower of London video. By the 16th century, the Tower Menagerie was open to the public, but safety precautions didn't necessarily exist. A young boy had his leg, quote, torn in a dangerous manner by a monkey, and the leopards became known for swiping people's belongings and ripping them into shreds. A young woman lost her arm and then her life to a lion, and it is known that more than one member of staff were fatally wounded whilst working in the menagerie. In a sad state of affairs, the animals kept at the tower were often pitted against each other in a popular form of public entertainment. It's also worth noting that nobody looking after these animals really knew what they were doing. Many animals are noted to have been given copious amounts of wine or beer, and a strange belief that ostriches could eat anything led to the ones kept here being fed iron and metals, which led to the death of at least 3 of them. By 1822, a professional zoologist was appointed keeper of the menagerie, and conditions and life expectancy for the animals here changed drastically. By 1828, there were over 300 animals kept here, living in far better conditions than their predecessors, although it still wasn't great. But the expense of keeping these creatures and the routine accidental maimings or escape attempts by the animals began to outweigh the fun, or gravitas, of having their existence at the tower. The biting of a guard by a monkey in 1835 seemed to be the final straw, and the Menagerie was disbanded. The animals were given over to zoos throughout the country, and 150 of them were moved to Regent's Park, the beginnings of today's London Zoo. As we head to the next tower, you can see some of the Beefeater homes built into this curtain wall below, as well as somebody heading to or from work. The next tower, the Flint Tower, currently hosts an exhibition featuring the tower during the time of the First World War. Although by the beginning of the 20th century, the Tower of London was already known as a tourist attraction, it never officially abandoned its role as a prison, garrison, and execution site. So, when the announcement came that Britain would be going to war in 1914, the tower came back to life, once again resuming its role as a forbidding prison, holder of arms and armaments, location of a powerful garrison, and site of terrifying executions. In the city of London, 1,300 men who worked for firms based in the capital joined the City of London Battalion, and they were all sworn in here at the tower, in the area that previously held the moat. Many soldiers awaited deployment at the tower, and, when called, left the tower to go directly to the front lines. In 1915, it was suggested by the British Army headquarters for the London district that the Tower Fortress should be the location for the execution of a number of spies that had been captured during the war. The thought was that the fortress, with its fearsome historical reputation, could strike more terror in potential enemy soldiers than anywhere else in the country. The Tower Constable agreed, and by 1916, 11 spies had been executed by firing squad within the walls of the tower. Most were executed in the miniature firing range that had been erected in the tower moat, originally built for weapons training, although 2 were simply shot in a tower ditch. These executions were the first the tower had seen in over 170 years, and more people would be killed within the walls of the tower during the First World War than during the entire Tudor period. After the war, the tower resumed life as a tourist attraction. At the time, few realized that this would be merely a 19-year gap before the tower would again rise to the occasion of the country's return to war. This display case holds 5 handmade ceramic poppies, which were part of the installation Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red by artist Paul Cummins and Tom Piper. These poppies filled the tower moat between July and November 2014 in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. 888,246 ceramic poppies were handcrafted, one to represent each British or colonial serviceman killed during the war, whose names were all read out in a nightly roll of honor throughout the event. You have already seen in my footage from 2025 that another display of poppies is currently visible throughout the tower. These are part of a new display by the same artists called The Tower Remembers. It features 30,000 poppies placed here to mark the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. Directly ahead of us here is the Devereux Tower, named after Robert Devereux, a fallen favorite of Queen Elizabeth I, who has the dubious honor of being the last person beheaded on Tower Green. As we round the corner, you'll see the bell on top of our next destination, St. Peter ad Vincula. So, the official name of this chapel is the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. Chapel Royal means it serves the spiritual needs of the reigning sovereign, and ad Vincula means in chains, so you can see it as the King's Chapel of St. Peter in chains. The foundation date of the chapel is unknown, as it's been destroyed, rebuilt, and relocated several times. In fact, some historians think this chapel predates the tower itself. Certainly, when clear records began in the early 13th century, the chapel was outside of the original tower walls and was a local parish church. But by 1241, Henry III's updated tower walls surrounded the chapel, making it part of the tower complex. The current structure dates from 1520, rebuilt after a fire had destroyed the previous version. Filming and photography are not permitted within the chapel, although on the day I visited, it was closed to the public, as it is currently undergoing 2 renovation projects. Firstly, they're working to restore one of the windows, and secondly, they have recently carried out some excavation work to build a lift into the building, which actually uncovered some surprising items. An incredibly rare burial shroud, incense pots, jewelry, and the remains of over 20 people, all buried between the 13th to the 17th centuries. The investigation to learn more about these individuals is currently ongoing. Inside, the chapel is beautiful, but simple, and mostly decorated with dozens and dozens of monuments. The original Tudor ceiling is said to have been built in Spanish chestnut for Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, the idea being that she could express her spiritual faith under the auspices of her homeland. However, it is not the church itself that most people come to see, but rather the resting place of some of England's most famous and tragic figures. Near the entrance is situated a golden plaque that lists 34, quote, remarkable persons who were buried here between 1534 and 1747. The plaque is an important marker because the actual location within the chapel of some of the bodies of these individuals has long been lost to time. Near the top of the list are victims of Henry VIII, St. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, and his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. All 3 were victims of Henry's rapid changes of favor, religious and political beliefs, and his terribly nasty habit of executing anyone who did not do as he ordered. Also on this list is Lord Guilford Dudley, executed for treason at the age of 18 or 19 in 1554, along with his much more famous wife, Lady Jane Grey, better known as the 9 Days Queen, who was deposed by and executed on the orders of her cousin, Queen Mary I. Also commemorated is James, Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of Charles II, who rebelled against his uncle, King James II, and was executed for his treason. For more information on all these tragic stories, subscribe to my channel and keep an eye out for upcoming videos which will explore their deaths in detail. Outside of the chapel is Tower Green, and a monument that marks the site of where it was thought the scaffold once stood. Later research suggests it was actually elsewhere in the complex, and I'll show you where in a bit. Now, the Tower of London has a sinister reputation of torture and beheadings, but in reality, between the building of the White Tower in the 11th century to the turn of the 20th century, just 10 people were executed inside the tower complex. The rest of them, and there were plenty, were executed just around the corner here on Tower Hill, near the current Tower Hill Underground Station. Here is a beautiful memorial dedicated to the individuals who were executed here at the tower. It's a glass cushion representing a place to lay one's head. The inscription around it reads, quote, "Gentle visitor, pause a while. Here you stand, death cut away the light of many days. Here, jeweled names were broken from the vivid threat of life. May they rest in peace while we walk the generations around their strife and courage under the restless skies." Only the nobility were executed here. Important people were afforded a private death behind the walls of the tower. Everybody else faced the humiliation of a public execution outside the walls, where I just showed you, oftentimes watched by thousands. The final resting place of many of them is at the chapel where we just were. Adjacent to the memorial is the imposing Beauchamp Tower, named after Thomas Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, who was imprisoned here in 1397. A number of high-born prisoners were kept in this building throughout the centuries, and the walls are marked with their carvings and graffiti, some of which are quite elaborate. It was incredibly crowded on the day I visited, but I got some photographs to show you some of the more remarkable pieces of graffiti. This elaborate piece depicts a Sacred Heart on the left, a kneeling figure in the center, and a coat of arms on the right, which showcases the shield of the Peveril family. The shield can be more clearly seen in this second piece, with the family name, Peveril, carved in the bottom right. It's believed these were made by Thomas Peveril, a Catholic prisoner kept here in 1570. This highly detailed carving is thought to be the work of a specialist, but is associated with the Dudley family. Robert Dudley, a future friend to Elizabeth I, was imprisoned here with his brothers in the aftermath of his family's attempt to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne. The central figures represent the Dudley family coat of arms, and the various plants each represent a Dudley brother. Speaking of Dudley, here is his personal emblem, oak leaves and acorns, thought to have been carved by Robert himself. Here is Anne Boleyn's falcon emblem, thought to have been carved by one of her supporters. This clever piece was done by Thomas Abel, priest to Catherine of Aragon, and you can clearly see the A on the bell he has carved, referring to his name. The most famous carvings here are two with a single name, Jane. Many believe these are the work of Lady Jane Grey's doomed husband, Lord Guilford Dudley, who was imprisoned here. From her rooms near the Queen's house, Jane would have witnessed her husband being led out of the Beauchamp Tower to his execution, and also witnessed his headless body being brought back after his execution. The Beauchamp Tower partially overlooks Tower Green and the Tudor-era timbered buildings here. The one with a Kingsguard soldier out front is home to the resident governor of the tower. Not a bad address to have, although it's said to be terribly haunted. Again, check out my Tower of London Ghost video for that story. It was within a room in this building that Guy Fawkes signed his confession, admitting to his involvement in the gunpowder plot. Now we're headed to the Waterloo Barracks, today often referred to as the Waterloo Block, built by order of the Duke of Wellington in the 19th century. This is the largest single building to ever stand inside the Tower of London complex. Originally housing hundreds of soldiers, today it's an administrative building and holds many of the offices for Tower staff. And it's where we are standing, in the space between the White Tower here and the Waterloo block, that it is believed the actual Tower of London scaffold used to stand, although, as we have seen, the memorial is outside of the Beauchamp Tower, directly ahead there. But what brings most people to this part of the tower is not its military history, but for what lies inside, just through this door, the Jewel House, the home of the crown jewels of the United Kingdom. The majority of the crown jewels have been kept within various locations inside the Tower of London since 1303, and were moved here to the Waterloo block in 1994. You can see the silver barriers here, which are used for crowd control in the summer. Of course, considering the precious items kept within this building, there are always soldiers on guard. When you enter to see the crown jewels, you are actually walking into what is essentially a giant vault. Note that for security reasons, video and photography is absolutely forbidden inside the building. The crown jewels are the collection of royal ceremonial objects that are worn and used by British kings and queens during their coronations and other ceremonial events. The entire collection is made up of 142 objects containing 23,578 stones, and it's believed that this collection is the most historically complete out of any regalia in the world. The items were last used at the coronation of King Charles III in May of 2023. One notable piece is the imperial state crown, worn during the monarch's exit from the coronation, as well as the state openings of Parliament. Among its nearly 3,000 stones are the Black Prince's Ruby, a 170-carat red spinel given to King Edward III's eldest son in 1367, as well as 3 pearls said to have belonged to Queen Elizabeth I. Shockingly, it was dropped by the Duke of Argyll during Queen Victoria's coronation, and she described it as, quote, squashed like a pudding. The collection also holds some of the largest and most famous diamonds on Earth, such as the Koh-i-Noor, weighing in at 105.6 carats. The diamond, mined in India, was given to Queen Victoria as a spoil of war in 1849, and she wore it as a brooch. Her daughter-in-law, Queen Alexandra, would wear it in a crown for the first time at her coronation in 1902, as did her daughter-in-law, Queen Mary of Teck, at her coronation in 1911, in what is my personal favorite piece of the collection. The crown used to be called the Crown of Queen Mary, but is now known as the Crown of Queen Camilla, after she was crowned with it at the most recent coronation. The Koh-i-Noor, however, is no longer in this crown, as it was moved to a different one for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in 1937. Currently, the Koh-i-Noor is not in usage for fear of a diplomatic dispute with India, who claim ownership of the stone. Also in the collection are the 9 major stones that were cut from the Cullinan diamond, the largest gem-quality diamond ever found, weighing in at a whopping 3,106.75 carats. The largest of the diamonds made from the original stone is known as Cullinan I, and sits atop the sovereign scepter with cross. That scepter, along with one topped by a dove, which represents the monarch's spiritual role, are handed to the sovereign during their coronation, along with a golden orb representing Christian sovereignty over the world. During this time, the monarch is officially crowned using St. Edward's crown, which weighs in at 2.23 kilograms, or nearly 5 pounds. The oldest item in the collection is the coronation spoon, dating from the late 12th century, and was most likely made for King Henry II or King Richard I. Silver gilt and set with 4 pearls, it is used to anoint the new sovereign with holy oil, confirming them as the supreme governor of the Church of England. All these items belong to an institution known as the Crown, which means they don't personally belong to the people wearing them. They essentially belong to the kingdom. And where better to keep them safe than the kingdom's most historical and secure fortress? Opposite the Jewel House is our next stop, the White Tower. This is the original Tower of London, built here by William the Conqueror in the 1080s, and at the time of construction, it was the largest castle keep in Christendom. The White Tower is actually thought to be the most complete 11th century palace in all of Europe. It was multi-purpose, being both the strongest point of the tower militarily, but also providing accommodation for the king and his family. It wouldn't be until the 1200s and the reign of Henry III that the fortifications and walls around the tower that we recognize today were built. And it was also in the reign of Henry that the tradition of keeping the tower whitewashed began, giving it the name we still use today. Right up ahead are the remains of the Wardrobe Tower, built during the reign of King Richard I and directly attached to the Roman wall. This would have been the easternmost edge of the tower in the 12th century, as it was the easternmost edge of the city for the Romans 800 years earlier. For centuries, this stone was part of a larger building known as the Wardrobe, where kings and queens stored their valuables. But it eventually fell into disrepair and has been out of use for centuries. As we make our way to the entrance of the White Tower, you can see more of the poppies on display. What do you guys think of them? Let me know in the comments. A wooden staircase takes us to the entrance of the White Tower, and awaiting us at the top are a couple of ravens holding court here. You can see these are the tower's most famous celebrities. Alright, let's go in. Originally, the White Tower would have been a home for the king and queen, filled with roaring fires, tapestries, and luxurious furniture. But today, it's a museum holding a branch of the royal armouries. On display are amazing examples of arms and armor going back centuries. Truthfully, the White Tower could be an entire video on its own, so I'll stick to some highlights, like this suit designed for King Henry VIII. I sometimes wonder if Henry designed this one himself. This suit dates from around 1540, when Henry was nearing 50 and no longer the fit young man of his youth. But he still wanted to be seen as a great warrior, sparing no expense when it came to purchasing this elaborately detailed set of armor. But there's another suit of Henry's I'd like to show you, which does date from his glory days. Check this out, a suit with a skirt. constructed to offer additional protection to the groin and thighs. But I like the detail here. See the K's and H's. These stand for Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, made during the time of their marriage. Here you can get a view of what he would have looked like in all his glory. At over 6 feet tall, Henry would have cut quite an impressive figure. And over here, a truly ornate suit of armor made for Prince Henry, eldest son of King James I. This is special not only for the beautiful detail, but because we actually have a portrait of the prince wearing it. It was made for him around 1607, when he would have been 13. Prince Henry never reached the throne, and for more information on that story, check out my video on the downfall of King Charles I. And we head around the corner now to see one of the creepiest things I'll show you. These are masks of kings made to display armor in the previous exhibition here. There's Henry VIII in the center, and Charles I to the right. Here are 2 other favorites. These are referred to as the dwarf and the giant. The smaller suit was likely made for King Charles I when he was a boy of about 5 years of age. The dragon at the top is just so cool to me. The larger is German field armor for a man of about 6'8", dating from the early 17th century. For many years, it was thought to be the armor of John of Gaunt, but it is now thought it was a later diplomatic gift from the Dukes of Brunswick. So we're now going to leave this floor of the tower and go to the next one up. The layout of the White Tower has remained the same throughout time, but originally the tower would have had staircases in the corners. These modern ones have been built for our usage. Now, if you've watched any of my other detailed virtual tours, you'll know I always have to showcase one of these. Remember that I told you this building was a royal palace, which means it came with a number of amenities, such as this, a garderobe, or a medieval toilet, conveniently emptying right under the ground below. Lovely. In times gone by, some people would keep their clothing in these chambers, believing the ammonia from the urine would dissuade pests. I'll just take their word for it. The next stop on our tour does not permit filming inside, but I did take some photos for you. Within the White Tower is a beautiful Norman church, St. John's Chapel. One of the finest surviving examples of Norman architecture, this chapel was built for private worship for the king and queen, as opposed to public worship that would have taken place at St. Peter at Vincula. The chapel also served as a hiding place for Richard II and future King Henry IV during the Peasants' Revolt. It saw the lying in state of Henry VII's wife, Elizabeth of York, after her death in 1503, and it held the betrothal of Mary I to Philip II of Spain. This display is interesting to me. A number of swords and the kings who wielded them. We start on the far right with King George VI, then George V, Edward VII, William IV, and George's 4, 3, 2, and 1, noticeably skipping the 63 years of Queen Victoria between Edward and William. Which one is your favorite? I think it's gotta be George III for me. Up more stairs now to the second floor, the topmost floor. The top floor was added in the 15th century. and there is no evidence of amenities like garderobes or fireplaces, so we think this floor was only ever really used for storage. But today, it is home to an amazing sculpture made out of arms and armor. It's actually a historical tradition to make creatures such as this to amaze visitors to armories. This guy is called Keeper, and he weighs almost 3,000 pounds. Look at his feet, made out of rifles, guarding the barrels of gunpowder or ale, slightly more precious, beneath him. Keeper is a dragon, as you can see, but throughout the centuries, visitors to the grand storehouse, where artillery and small arms were once stored within the tower, would have come face to face with a serpent, or at one point, a 7-headed hydra. And now to the bottom. You might remember we stood at the top of the wooden stairs, where the ravens were holding court to enter the White Tower. Those stairs were a common Norman architectural feature. The wooden stairs could be easily taken down in preparation for an attack. These permanent stone steps in the corner of the tower will take us all the way down to ground level, and would have been the only way to access the basement centuries ago. At various times throughout the centuries, the basement provided a storehouse for ammunition, and today is set up as such. Look at these huge cannonballs, and all the cannon here, dating back to the 1700s. If you can imagine every inch of this entire floor, and many of the towers we have explored, just full of weaponry like this, you can see why the Tower of London was such an awe-inspiring place. This bronze 24-pounder gun was captured from Cherbourg in 1758 during the 7 Years' War. Not just a palace or an armory, the White Tower was also used as a prison and a site of torture. In fact, it was in these rooms that Guy Fawkes was tortured after his arrest for involvement in the gunpowder plot. To get an idea of what Guy Fawkes endured at the Tower, compare his signature from before he was imprisoned at the bottom to his signed confession at the top after undergoing unspeakable hardships here within the White Tower. A testament to the brutal events that took place in this room is a display case at the far end, featuring an executioner's axe and block. The case tells of the execution of Robert Devereux, the last person to be beheaded in the Tower of London. Although the axe here does date to the 16th century, it is not the one that dealt Robert his fate. Most execution blocks were designed to be single-use, burnt after the sentence had been carried out. However, this block has survived. It dates to the mid-1700s and is thought to have been created for the execution of Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat. Any Outlander fans watching? You'll notice there are 2 deep cuts into the wood clearly visible. It honestly kind of creeps me out. Although not for Robert, this axe was indeed used by an executioner 500 years ago. If you're into dark history and you enjoyed thinking about Guy Fawkes being tortured in the White Tower, well, find a therapist. But you'll love the name of this building, the Bloody Tower. The Bloody Tower got its name in the 16th century, as it was associated with the disappearance and likely murder of the princes in the tower, 2 sons of Edward IV, who were imprisoned after their uncle seized control of the country, never to be seen again. Again, you can find out more about that in my Ghosts of the Tower of London video. As we overlook the ruins of a curtain wall, you'll recall that I told you a relatively small number of people were actually executed here at the tower, just 22 in total. But as for torture, that's another story, and an exhibition in these buildings shares that story with us. On record, there are 48 prisoners known to have been tortured in the Tower of London, mostly in the 16th and 17th centuries, and usually in an effort to get the victim to name co-conspirators. There are a few examples of the instruments used in torture at the tower on display both in the White Tower and here in the Wakefield Tower. The first item on display is the Scavenger's Daughter, and there are two versions of this kept at the Tower of London, this one and this one in the White Tower. This instrument was invented during the reign of Henry VIII by Sir Leonard Skevington, Lieutenant of the Tower. The painful contortions made by this device could force blood out of all body orifices, leading to death, although few prisoners would make it that long before talking. In direct juxtaposition to the Scavenger's Daughter, compressing a body as tight as possible, comes the rack, doing the exact opposite. With ankles fastened to one end and wrists to another, the rack would pull people in two directions until their joints dislocated, then separated. Occasionally, two prisoners would be brought to the rack, one to be tortured and one to watch. It was said that the loud sounds of a person's body breaking was often enough to elicit a confession from the spectator. But only sometimes. The only woman known to have been tortured at the tower, Anne Askew, an Anabaptist, was arrested for heresy in 1545. She was racked 3 times, leaving her with injuries so severe she had to be carried to her own execution. Jesuit priest Henry Walpole was also racked at the tower in 1594. But despite the best efforts of tower wardens, neither he nor Anne ever named any other practicing so-called heretics. And lastly, over here, the manacles. Very simple and very effective, and at one time the most commonly used form of torture in Britain. The manacles were used to suspend a victim off the ground, with all their weight being borne by their hands and wrists. Prisoners could hang upwards of 6 hours before being let down. Oftentimes, weights would be attached to their feet to increase the pain they felt. The ones on display here have been at the tower since 1675. And on that cheery note, we're finally ready to say goodbye to the Tower of London. Luckily for us, we are leaving happily, and with our heads still attached. Now, I've done my best to include my favorite stories and highlights from the tower, but with 1,000 years of history, I'm sure there are a few things I might have missed. If there's anything you'd like more information on, let me know in the comments. But shortly before we exit, we have one more hidden gem. I told you already about the Beefeaters, and that they not only work here, but live here as well. And it wouldn't be fair to make somebody live and work in a place without a pub, would it? That would be actual torture. So over here is the Keys, a secret London pub open only to the yeoman warders and their guests. It's 150 years old and serves unique brews and loads of Beefeater gin, of course. Inside, it's decorated with old Beefeater uniforms, old photographs, an execution axe, historical artifacts, and the signature of Rudolf Hess, who was imprisoned in the tower during World War II. What a cheery ambience. And with that, we make our way out of the Tower of London and return to the 21st century. I know a lot of you have been waiting for an updated Tower of London tour, so I hope you enjoyed this and found it worth the wait. Thank you to William the Conqueror and Henry III for providing such an interesting place to explore, to the craftsman who created the dragon helmet that I wish I owned, and of course to you for watching. This has been Crown and Kingdom. I'm Margot Moore, wishing you goodbye and good times.